right, welcome back everyone to the Madness and Grace podcast. How's it going, Matt?
Going well. How are you today, Emily?
Good. It's a little funny because we just recorded another episode and I'm asking you how we're doing, but sometimes that's just what you got to do.
Well, now it's just back to you and me, just talking about mental health and stuff.
Totally. But today I just wanted to talk about something that I've just been seeing so much about in the news, on social media, which is kind of a reoccurring theme when I'm picking topics. It's just kind of, what is everyone talking about right now? And I feel like things can get really confusing and people can use sort of buzzwords. We were talking a minute ago, gaslight, narcissist, what do these things really mean? And the one that really stuck out to me recently is boundaries. And a lot of people have different definitions of the word. What have you heard about it?
No, I think you're right. And you hear that a lot with anybody that, when they upset you or they've said something that you don't agree with, so they'll throw out that's a boundary that I hold up or
Right.
You're crossing my boundary. Sometimes people refer to it as triggering them.
Right.
Those types of things. And, part of the problem with that is that it's impossible to adhere to a boundary if you don't know it exists. And so, so then boundaries become kind of moving targets. One time you're okay with something and another time you're not. And that's not really a boundary. That's just a kind of a personal feeling or preference for the moment. Boundaries are important in relationships. We had one of our previous guest, John Townsend, he wrote a very famous book called Boundaries with Henry Cloud. In fact, frankly, I think one of the reasons you hear about that term thrown out so much now is because of that book.
Yeah.
But if you read the book, you will find out what real boundaries are.
Right. Not the buzzword boundaries on.
Not the buzzword, right?
Matt, can you explain why setting boundaries with family and friends is crucial for maintaining your own mental health?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, number one, I think we all have to understand we have boundaries, whether we recognize them or not. We all have set boundaries, at least in our heads, for how we expect other people to respond towards us, to treat us, to speak to us, things like that. And so, we tend to not be happy or we get upset when someone crosses that boundary. The reality is that when in a closer, I'm not talking about an acquaintance relationship where you barely know the person. I'm talking about in a more intimate or like you said, family, friends type of thing. Your families, typically, it's pretty obvious how people want to be treated. They tend to treat you. I mean, it's obviously right from the Bible, treat others the way you want them to treat you, right? And so, how to treat your family and your friends because that's how you want to be treated. So you tend to have the same boundaries for them that you would want them to have for you. Now, the problem comes in when you have a person who violates boundaries, just willy-nilly, they just do whatever they want to do. And then we don't set those boundaries kind of up for them to say, I don't appreciate when this occurs, and and I'm asking you not to do that. Now, the other thing about a boundary is, let's just, we're talking about boundaries, we're talking about countries. Okay, countries have a boundary, right? So there's a consequence when you cross over the border. Okay. I mean, we've been talking about that in the news a lot. Okay. And so if you cross over the border into some countries and you're not supposed to be there, you'll get killed. Okay. And so the thing is it's the same thing when we set up boundaries in our relationship. There needs to be a consequence for crossing a boundary. So if I tell you, I don't ever want you to call me Matt again. Okay. You're supposed to call me Dr. Stanford or whatever. I mean, whatever it may be. If you just keep calling me Matt and there is no consequence, well, why would you ever change? I mean, I'm rewarding your behavior in some sense. The other thing is, I also probably need to explain to you why it's important to me that you not call me that. What is it that does to me? Maybe I don't know, I'm just making this up. Maybe it is that I like you to call me Dr. Stanford when we're in meetings with people from outside the organization, because I want them to understand what our relationship or whatever. You know what I'm saying?
Sure,
But if a person doesn't understand why a boundary exists, it doesn't mean that they have to agree with why it exists. They have to just understand why you want it to exist because it's your boundary. Okay.
Right.
And then they also have to know what the consequence is for crossing the boundary, and
Right.
in a relationship, that consequence may be that you're going to ultimately damage our relationship. Like we're not going to be able to be in a relationship, but a relationship with zero boundaries is destined to just hurt two people. I mean, there's just
Right.
no doubt about that. And ultimately could cause significant damage in those individuals, depending on what we're talking about in the context of boundaries.
Everyone has boundaries. It's just about communicating them. So there
Absolutely.
is no
Absolutely.
relationship with no boundaries, but there is a relationship where you have them and you just don't say what they are and you're hurt.
Right. And
So
if your boundary is, don't ever stand closer than, I'm again just making this up,
yeah,
closer
yeah,
than 3 feet to me, but every time you're talking to somebody, you stand 2 inches away from them, they're
right,
not going to understand why you want that to be your boundary, because
right.
that's not a, so typically when you set a boundary, you also follow a boundary. Like
Yeah.
if my boundary is I don't want to hear you use a curse word. Okay,
Hmm.
this is a very common one that we families set up with people that have serious mental illness, because a lot of times they will use foul language when they're not thinking correctly and things like that. And the boundary is in the home, in our interactions with one another, you will not use foul language. Well, if I say that's the boundary, but then I'm cursing at you every time I talk to you, how
Yeah.
could I ever expect you to, in essence, what I'm saying is the boundary I just set up is meaningless. And so again, it goes both ways. I think a lot of times when we think about boundaries, we think about boundaries are things you set up for other people, but they're not things that you necessarily have to be interested in.
Well, how can one overcome feelings of guilt or fear when it comes to setting boundaries? Personally, I think I have dealt with this with friends, and you just feel bad for saying, I can't be there for you emotionally right now. And you just feel guilty for
Right.
conveying that. So, how can someone overcome that?
Well, I think one of the things you have to understand is that you don't set up boundaries to punish people. You set
Hmm.
up boundaries to try to make a relationship more healthy. They're always
Yeah.
set up that for that reason. If
Mhm.
you're setting up a boundary to punish someone, then you should just end the relationship. That's
Right.
not what they're for. Boundaries are set up so that people can become successful and a
Hmm.
relationship can become more healthy. So you have to let the guilt go right away, because the only reason you're willing to even set up a boundary is because you want to maintain the relationship and you want it to become more healthy. That's a positive thing. You don't
Yeah.
set up a boundary because you don't want to have the relationship anymore. If that's why you're setting up the boundary, if you say, I don't want to interact with you anymore, Matt, because you're toxic to me, well, that's not a boundary. What you're
Yeah.
telling me is, or I should say, you say, don't call me anymore because you're toxic.
Yeah.
Okay, that's not a boundary. That's
Mhm.
ending a relationship. You
Right.
need to recognize it as that. But if
Yeah.
you say, okay, let's say that I'm your crazy uncle that calls you all the time, and I just, I dump everything on you and you just can't take anymore. And you say, look, I can't, I just don't have, I'm not at a place in my life right now where I can really help you walk through that. I want to maintain a relationship. I care for you,
Mhm.
and I'm happy to do that. So, but you text me every day and you ask me all these questions. So I'm only going to respond to you in the evening, or I'm
Right.
only going to, like, I remember I had a client that at the time she was going through a crisis situation, so she had my cell phone, and every morning at 7:30 she would start texting me,
Oh,
and I
wow.
mean she would text me constantly throughout the day.
Yeah.
And the boundary I set up, and I mean I'd given her the number, so I mean
Right.
I knew she would contact, but the boundary I gave her was I will respond to you at 4 o'clock every day.
Mhm.
And that's it. I'm going to respond to you, and then I'm not going to respond to you again until so what that did over time was that she knew that I would respond because
Yeah.
our relationship would continue, but she also began to not start peppering me literally every 5 minutes with a text throughout the day. She knew to wait. And
Yeah.
so again, you're trying to make the relationship more, so you have to let the guilt go.
Yeah.
The other thing is you have to understand that if a person violates a boundary, there's a consequence, and you only do them a disservice by
Mhm.
not having them feel the pain of the consequence. A boundary is meaningless if there's no consequence. There is no boundary if
Right.
there's an empty threat, in a sense. There's no boundary if there's no consequence. There has to be a consequence, and the consequence needs to be reasonable. It needs to be a reasonable consequence.
Could you give maybe some examples of situations where boundaries need to be set and how they can be handled? I'm sure there is an endless amount of situations where boundaries need to be set, but maybe just some general examples.
Yeah, and I think, most people, when they're asking you about boundaries, just like this conversation we're having right now, they're not really interested in boundaries in normal, healthy relationships. I mean, people that are able to regulate their emotions, that have normal cognitive processing, that that have appropriate kind of relation, kind of care for one another, don't come to you, as a psychologist and go, can you tell me how to set up boundaries? They only come to you and ask you that when there's a problem relationship. So I'll give some examples around that. So one of the things that we deal with a lot here at the Hope and Healing Center in our clinic, particularly parents of adult children with a mental illness. The adult children have a mental illness or an addiction, which we actually talked about in an earlier episode. And so, and usually what it is that individual is acting out in some way that is either they're involved in criminality, they're involved in aggressive or threatening behavior. I mentioned earlier the use of foul language. I mean, they're doing something that's making these parents that are probably caring for them because of the hard times that they're in, making them feel like they can't have that individual in their home anymore. And so like a real classic one is you have an adult child with mental illness and that they're using drugs. And you're like, well, I don't want them to use drugs. Well, I don't want them to use drugs either, but you don't have control over what an adult does.
Right.
But you do have control over what goes on in your home. And so if that individual lives with you, one of the boundaries that we often will start out with is you need to tell that individual, you are not to use or to have illegal substances in this home, period. So hear what I'm saying. I'm not saying you will not use them. I'm saying you will not use them in my home and you will not have them in my home. And then usually the consequence there is, if you are using them in my home or I find them in my home, I will call the authorities.
Yeah.
So that's the consequence. And you must do that if that happens. So if you go into their room and there's a bag of cocaine laying on the dresser, you call the police and you say, I found a bag of cocaine in my house.
Yeah.
And so there's a consequence for that. Now, the thing is that if they use cocaine down the street, that's their choice. I know that you don't want that, but you have no control over that at that point. Another thing would be, like I said, the use of foul language, any type of threatening behavior, bringing certain peers around that are negative influences. I can't keep an adult from hanging out with certain people, but I certainly can keep an adult from hanging out with those individuals in my home. I certainly can keep an adult from using my car for certain things. If I say, you are not to take my car to that person's home, and the only way I'm going to allow you to borrow my car, and so that's the boundary. And then the only way I'm going to allow you to borrow my car is if you allow me to use GPS to track your phone, so I know where you are. And when I see that car, if I see that car at that person's house, well, then you're never in my car again. So again, but what you're doing is you're giving the person an opportunity to be successful. And I think that's the thing people forget about. If you set up some boundaries for someone and they're successful over a period of time, you need to reward them. You don't just go, oh, well, great. I only do something when they mess up. You only punish them. And a consequence isn't a punishment, it's a consequence. And so, you reward them. Hey, you know what? You've been doing a great job with the car. I'll let you borrow it another night a week now or whatever, So, behavior that's rewarded is more likely to be repeated. If you set up a boundary and you allow that person to violate that boundary over and over and over, and you do nothing, there is no consequence, you're rewarding a negative behavior. But you have to reward the positive behaviors, and you have to enact the consequences for the other. And it can be something simple. It can literally be a boundary might be, you have to put your dishes away after dinner. And I know sometimes with people with mental health problems, it can become as simple as that. But if you don't do that, well, then I'm not going to prepare a meal for you. You'll have to prepare your own meal. It's just simple. It can be simple things. It can be very complex things. It just depends.
I appreciate how you're saying, it can help the other individual. I feel like boundaries tend to be a kind of like self-preservation type of thing, but it's not only helping you, it's helping the person
Absolutely.
that you're setting
It's a
with.
two-way street. I mean, you're
Right.
trying to help the other person learn
Mm-hmm.
how to engage in an appropriate way, because for some reason, whatever that may be, and obviously if it's mental health problem or addiction or something like that, then we have, I guess in some sense, we have a little more compassion for that person. You may
Right.
be at your wit's end, but
Mm-hmm.
like I'm only setting this up so that I don't, strangle them, kind of a thing. But the reality is you're only setting it up because you want to make the relationship more healthy. And I think that's where you have to start when you're setting up the boundary, as opposed to, I'm going to set this up and this is their last chance kind of thing. If you're ready to end the relationship, if you're setting up a boundary and you said this is their last chance, just end the relationship,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
you've already decided. Basically, all you're doing is waiting for them to violate a boundary. So just
Yeah.
now's the time to end a relationship. And in some sense, ending a relationship is a boundary.
Yeah, that's good advice. We're all different. And I think cultural and societal factors play into a lot of things, not just boundaries, but all sorts of things that have to do with mental illness. But do you think that cultural and societal factors make it harder to set boundaries with family and friends? Maybe your family is extremely traditional in some ways, or they think that you're going against them, is kind of the theme that
No,
I've seen
absolutely.
around boundaries. Yeah.
Yeah, I see. I mean, there certainly are cultural differences. There's no doubt about that. I mean,
Yeah.
some families, they're some cultures, the extended family is it's much closer. They may even live together closer.
Hmm.
There may be, kind of cultural taboos on, setting up boundaries where a person isn't able to engage or be in the home or stuff like that. Again, I think you have to step back and you have to say, a lot of times those cultural norms were set up in the context of normal, healthy relationships.
Yeah.
And so if you're actively setting up a boundary, you don't have a normal, healthy relationship. There's a reason that you're doing that. If you had a normal, healthy relationship, the boundaries, they take care of themselves,
Hmm.
because you're able to engage that person and they're able to pick up on your boundaries and you're able to pick up on theirs. So I think, you have to kind of, in some sense, you have to kind of move cultural norms to the side and say, hey, I understand what our culture says, but this is not a normal, healthy relationship because of X, because of bipolar disorder, because of substance use or whatever. So I think
Yeah.
that's one thing. I think another thing is that, there are societal things that occur in the sense of, our society now tends to not want a lot of boundaries, not a lot of rules,
Mhm.
things like that. We do a lot of interaction through social media and kind of information technology kind of stuff. You don't set up boundaries on a text.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, you don't text somebody and say, this is what you have to do from now on. You have that has to be in person, so that you can have that kind of face-to-face emotional interaction so they can pick up on what's going on. I also think that, again, you have to say, hey, I know how I may have lived my life. Maybe I'm really a free spirit and I don't like a lot of rules, but that's in a normal, healthy situation. This is not one. So we're trying to set it up. And I also think when you set boundaries up and you're having a conversation with the person, you explain to them the boundaries are being set up so that you can mend the relationship, so it can be a healthy relationship, so we can maintain a relationship, so that you can be more successful in whatever it is that you're not being successful in right now. And the day will come, hopefully, that these boundaries don't have to be so rigid and in
Right.
place. And so, I mean, I think if you start from that place, it's a little bit easier, but you undoubtedly are going to get pushback. And I'll tell you a good example, good modern example, and that is a family where the mother and the father aren't married,
Hmm.
but they have a child or even an adult child that they have to deal with. And one sets up a boundary and the other one just doesn't recognize it. So,
Yeah.
I mean, they set it up for the child.
Right.
And so, the mother says, you can't do this, or this is going to happen. And as soon as they go to the father's house or talk to the father, they can do whatever they want and there's no consequence. And then that causes more conflict. I mean, again, that's we have to be better than that.
Yeah.
And we have to, if we're setting up a boundary, we're saying, I want this person to do better so they can be better. We have to look beyond our own kind of personal problems that we have with one another. But that I see that all the time with families that are, kind of broken families, because particularly if you're the custodial parent, they're with you more often, you're more likely to have to set up the boundary, and they go over to, Disneyland dad, and then there are no rules or no boundaries. And that ultimately is just going to lead to the detriment of the child.
What advice or tips do you have for someone who is hesitant or unsure about setting boundaries with their family or their friends?
Well, I think you have to ask yourself to begin with, why are you even looking to set a boundary? And have you, what is it from you personally that are making you, are you frightened? Is what's happening damaging to you? Is it that the situation is damaging for the other person, and that's why you're trying? Why is it that you're doing this? What is the core reason? And then I think you have to ask yourself the second question, which we were just talking about, and that is, am I doing this to punish the person, or am I doing this because I want to try to make the relationship more healthy over time and give the person an opportunity to change their behavior in a more positive? And if the answer is I want to punish them, then you need to end the relationship. I mean, because that's not that. I mean, that's a doomed strategy right there.
Right.
And then I think you sit down with the person after you've kind of thought it through. Sometimes it's a good idea to write it out. Sometimes it's a good idea to talk it through with somebody. But then sit down with that individual and you explain to them and make sure they understand. And it has to be very specific. And that is, the boundary is X. And if the boundary is violated, then Y occurs.
Right.
And I don't like boundaries that are set up of like, if you do X, I'm throwing you out.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't find that to be particularly helpful. What I would say, let's say something was at that serious of a level. I don't know what it is, but whatever it is. So what I would say is, if you do X, you're no longer going to be able to live here with me. And these are the three options of where I will help you go to. So, maybe that's a shelter, maybe that's a group home, maybe that's another relative that's agreed to take the person in. But you've already thought that through. I never think it's helpful to just put somebody out on the street kind of thing. I also find that families are really hesitant to even use that as a consequence, where they just put somebody on the street. So I just don't think it's a good idea. But to say you can't live here anymore, and I'm going to help you find an alternative place to live, when you are, if you just say it that way, well, then the consequence is meaningless, because when the day comes and they violate, then what are you going to take 6 months to find a place to live? You have to have done it ahead of time, where you know what's going to happen. And it may be going to a shelter or whatever that may be. And so, another consequence that I've seen is when you have someone who maybe has some delusional thinking or something like that at times, and when they don't take their medication and stuff, and they become very aggressive, and it's explained to them that if you don't take your medication, you become physically aggressive in this home, we will call the police. I mean, and you have to do that. I mean, sometimes that can be a life and death kind of situation. So you just have to make sure that the boundary's clear and the consequences clear, and that you follow through with that. Typically, people don't put this kind of thought into this, or they're not as specific in what I'm explaining. And that a lot of times is the problem. So it's like, you kind of thought what you would like the boundary to kind of be, and you kind of almost told them, but they should have picked up on it. And then they violated, and you blow up, and it doesn't help, and so you just have to be very specific. And the other thing is, if somebody is not willing, the next question people usually ask is, well, what if I sit down with them and I've got these 3 boundaries, and they go, well, I'm not doing that. Okay, well, what were the consequences of those boundaries? That's what's going to, if it was that they can't live there, then they're not going to be able to live there. If it was you and they are no longer going to have a relationship, well, then you're no longer going to have a relationship. That's
Hmm.
what they're telling you. It's an interaction. It's a
Yeah.
conversation. What they're telling you is, I'm not going to follow your boundaries. So I
Yeah.
dare you. I dare you. So, and we just you gotta not be guilty for that, because you're protecting yourself, you're protecting them, you're giving them an opportunity for a healthy interaction. Um, and depending on what the situation is, they may not be able to follow your boundaries. They may be at a mental state where they're not even able to do it. They may need to live somewhere else for a while.
Matt, thanks so much. I feel like this was a really insightful episode, again, just because it's just one of those words that's thrown around and nobody really knows what it means until they kind of dive deeper into it. So yeah, I think that was great.
Yeah, well, thank you. I do think it's a good question. I think we need to be, as a society, we need to be a little less sensitive than we are about
Hmm.
everything. I mean, stuff happens.
Yeah.
People say things you don't like. People say things you don't agree with. That's not
People make
necessarily
mistakes. Yeah.
right.
I
People
like,
make mistakes. People
yeah.
don't have to be just like you for you to have
Yeah.
a relationship, and people don't have to be just like you to make a relationship healthy. I mean,
Right.
so that's okay. People are prickly.
Yeah.
That's the nature of humanity.
All right. Well, thank you, Matt. And thank you to everyone who's listening. As always, I'm going to leave all of our Hope and Healing Center and Institute information in our show notes. I can even link to our past episode that we did with Dr. Townsend, who wrote that book, Boundaries. I think that
Yeah,
would be
it's a
a
great idea.
great resource. So thanks so much,
All
Matt.
right. Thank you.